Hey, Curtis.
Neighbors, what's up?
All's good. Thanks for joining. I feel like we've been teasing your eventually coming on this podcast for like 50 for almost a year now. So our audience finally getting the treat of
Is ready for the experience.
yes.
Well, yeah. Were we live yet? We're not live yet.
We're live.
This isn't live. We're live.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm waiting to post the. Have not quite yet posted the ticket link for my Hanania debate. That has to be carefully coordinated because Richard and I have to post it at the same time. Yeah, I'm debating Richard Hanania in LA on February 9th.
Excellent.
That'll be at the Adventurers Club, which is this amazing like Steve's Zoo type, facility. And it'll be amazing. It'll be fun. It'll be historic. It'll be something. I don't know.
I'll try to come for it. Maybe we'll get a moment of Zen crew or something. Dan's in LA is too. They what are you hoping for in that debate?
What am I hoping for in that debate? I think in every debate, sort of the main objective is to look as good as possible. And, in some ways that involves also, there's some kinds of looking good where your interlocutor also looks good. That's definitely, that's a potential outcome, On the other hand, I mean, everyone has areas that they're not really the best in, or where their perspective is, if not unusual, just, poorly developed. And so I would sort of hope to bring, I think that actually really, obviously I want to look good, but I always look good, right? What I really want is for Richard to come away from this conversation feeling that he's learned something, feeling that he's grown. And I feel like when I have that perceptive, perspective of this isn't a cage fight here, I'm here to learn. I'm ready to learn myself, and maybe we could both grow. I don't know, I think it'll be amusing. I think it'll be great. I think a lot of things about Richard. I think he's very intelligent. He's kind of funny looking. I don't know. Like,
what do you think he has to learn, or what do you think he should learn?
I think that if I could sort of briefly summarize the kind of flaws or issues. Flaws is a strong word to use about a fellow human being. The issues in kind of Richard's thinking. I feel that often a lot of his energy comes from a contrarian streak, which you're now seeing becoming kind of counter-contrarian. And it's always a little like whenever you get sort of counter-contrarian, you're in this weird space where you're sort of disagreeing with people, but you have this sort of wind of like power on your side in a way. And that's a sort of weird, bad combination. Somehow Richard manages to occupy the very unusual position for our time of simultaneously disbelieving in the gospel of human uniformity and yet believing completely in sort of mass migration of a slave labor class. And so I think it's maybe it may just be because back home in Jordan he grew up with a lot of servants or something. I don't know. I haven't delved into his background really, but like I feel that sort of the enthusiasm for kind of the slave labor model like basically makes me a little uncomfortable as an American who's sort of gone through. I mean, he is American. He's technically American, but like that. That is, I think, a strange sort of combination. I feel that more generally he sort of gets, really deeply into these kinds of sort of frames of intellectual games about sort of the way things. It's like he's written a couple of things recently about the budget process, right? Or the budget for what are we going to do about, Social Security when it runs a 5% of GDP, deficit. And I'm just like, Richard, like you're going and getting very autistic about all of these. Do you know the term? If you want to spend money on this thing, you've got to go out and find like that thing, which can be like scored as like, adding $5 billion to the budget. But in reality, the whole thing is just pumping out 10, 15% of GDP is red ink, right? And the sort of the principle of doing budgeting in the congressional appropriations process sort of on this like sort of within this framework that pretends that really still in some way America is not on, is on the gold standard. Well, I mean, America is really not on the gold standard. It's really on a soft currency. And you may not really like that or think that's the best way to run a country in abstract or whatever. It is what it is. Someone was on Twitter was posting that great line, the purpose of the system is what it does sort of thing. And in DC, there's a lot of like, people don't really look squarely at the reality of what DC is. And like, for example, make my favorite observation, which is that we don't actually have an executive branch in DC. We just have a legislative branch. And because the whole executive branch is micromanaged by the congressional process, right? Whereas the president's association with the executive branch is that the White House, which is not even really controlled by the president, issues executive orders, which basically, in terms of their constitutional status as like law, are tweets, basically. And so, you essentially have this thing whose budget, process, and personnel are all controlled, if controlled in a really strange, distant way by the Congress. And just the fact that it's called the executive branch and the president's, executive process gets to sort of dot it with 4,000, political appointee roles, which really are not really powerful over the things like the pyramid shaped, or, those of us who have worked in the private sector know what a pyramid shaped org chart is. And when we look at the so-called executive branch, we see a pyramid shaped org chart and we're like, oh, that must be a thing like the thing that I know the thing is. And it's just not a thing like that. And so, the thing is, when you're basically kind of coloring within the lines there and you're talking about, the budget process as though it was like a budget process that had limits on its ability to create red ink. There are many ways in which I don't agree with the MMT people, but their fundamental insight is essentially that soft currency is essentially government stock. And so, it's really weird that, a company is issuing 15% of its market cap in new stock every year. Okay, that's weird. It's definitely weird. But there's a lot of weird things about it. But it is what it is, right? And so, there are all these people sort of playing the game that would be a sort of legitimate game if it isn't what it isn't, what it is. So, over in DC, for example, there are all these kind of Project 2025 people where they're like, well, if we get a new Trump administration, it's got to get the right people in charge so we can really run the government. I'm like, Nixon tried to run the government and he had far more capable people than you'll ever have, Mr. Trump. And there was no way he could fucking run the government. And they just stabbed him in the back and took him out. Right. And so you're just like, you're sort of, when you play along with this kind of kayfabe and take it seriously, and your purpose of playing along with the kayfabe and taking it seriously is not to be like, okay, do you know what a shoot is in kayfabe? It's where you turn a fake wrestling match into a real, you actually get pissed at each other. If you have a plan to play along with this kayfabe and turn it into a shoot, that's one thing. But the thing is, if you're actually just sort of playing along with the thing and you're like, to switch, examples, you're like, oh no, an incompetent plagiarist, got put in charge of Harvard due to, her race or really her partisan affiliation. How do we fix this and turn Harvard back into what it should be? It's like, well, are you really thinking that? Or are you just trying to score some cheap media hit crack? Because if you're just trying to score some cheap media hit crack, that's great. But the thing is, if you think that you're doing something real there, and that's like, you have this like real chance of like really changing Harvard, man, and, because, and eliminating racism in both directions, because actually, have you thought about it? Did you know that the Democrats are actually the real racists? And like, somehow people who like who get sort of, kicked out of the left and wash up on the right, and realize that, are always just like, well, everybody's going to realize this soon, right? I'm just like, dude, you have no idea how this works, right? And there's this sort of, historical ignorance there. I was just reading the God. Let me find this. This is too precious. So I have a book which is the history of Cleveland. And it's an 800-page book on the history of Cleveland, which ends when it was published in 1850, in 1950, sorry. And, as you can imagine, ending in 1950 is a sort of, right, the main problem with this book is that there's no arc there. Actually, the title of the last chapter is called Greatness Achieved. And I'm like, okay, imagine that you take the author of this book, what's his name, William Ganson Rose, and you have some kind of time kidnapping machine, and you just like rip him out of time, out of like 1850, and you take him on a walking tour of Cleveland in 2023. Dude's gonna be like, whoa, what the hell happened? How we just like, what, right, because
greatness achieved.
What? Greatness achieved. Yeah, greatness perfected. Greatness finalized, and you try to convince him, that like, you'd achieved like outward greatness, but we've achieved like true inward, like moral greatness. Like, think about all these sins you were committing as you walk around this like, have you been to Cleveland? Anyone here been to Cleveland?
No, but I lived in Detroit for a bit, and they can often
yeah. I prefer to say it the French way, Detroit. But
real greatness has never been tried, Curtis.
Real greatness has never been tried, right? And so, I was reading this and I came across, it's sort of, most of the text of this book is just like, sort of cool, great, amazing things that happened, last year. And
was Cleveland a political machine city?
That's a good question. Cleveland was originally John D. Rockefeller's oil town, so I suspect that the Rockefeller interests always had. This is not a deep analytical history. This is more of like a congratulatory chronicle here. It's a strange sort of thing, but I'm reading this in any case. I get to the sort of the following three historical entries, and this is from 1919. Cathedral Latin School was dedicated June 8th. The first graduating class totaled 7. In 10 years, there was a capacity enrollment of 800 boys, and the school soon won a high rating in scholarship and athletics. A nationwide drive to jail radicals and red agitators was started June 12th as a result of the bombing of Mayor Davis' house. Shaker Players, second of Greater Cleveland's senior dramatic groups, was organized under the direction of Mrs. William Cochran. Now, one of these things is not quite like the other, is it? Right? So, and you're just like, you're walking around modern Cleveland, with William Ganson Rose, and he's like, what went wrong? And then he's like, maybe it's Cathedral Latin. Maybe the scholar athletes from Cathedral Latin just are going like full Clockwork Orange on like Christmas Day shoppers, and like, things have come to an end, or could it be the Shaker Players, with their no, I get it. You know what happened? Maybe we didn't jail enough radicals and red agitators. and if he was very intelligent, he might basically be looking at this and he'd be thinking, this is red Cleveland. This is red. We're looking at red Cleveland in like 2024. And so to have that, or, there's this, amazing sort of line in history from, you'll know about the Seattle General Strike.
I don't know about
No, I actually don't.
You've been to to Seattle. It's in the it's sort of north of Portland. It's Pacific Northwest. You've been there.
I know about Chaz. I know about Chaz, but I don't think that's the Seattle General Strike.
No, it's not the Seattle General Strike, although there's a very interesting line from the Seattle General Strike to that. So in 1919, when obviously I think the Wall Street bombing was that year, maybe. You know about the Wall Street bombing. Somebody drove a wagon full of gunpowder to, you can still see the pockmarks on like buildings in Wall Street from the Wall Street bombing, 1919. Anarchists, communists, foreigners, that kind of people, right? And actually a lot of the, just if we're going to sort of talk about the ethnic element here, a lot of the people involved in some of these early radical, communist movements were especially in the Pacific Northwest were Finns. There was a huge Finnish problem, actually, right? So the and sort of the Scandinavian energy in general was much higher at that time. So in any case, in 1919, things going as they are in Russia, that's getting a lot of press, obviously. The first Red Scare, by the fact that they call it a scare, you can tell who won. And but not sort of in an immediate way, because you had the Seattle General Strike in 1919 is, I think, best chronicled by a book by the guy who was the mayor of Seattle named Ole Hansen, who could barely speak English. He was this weird Scandinavian bro. And he's like, all right, the Wobblies are trying to take the city and establish a Soviet republic in Seattle. Not making this up at all. I'm not exaggerating, whatever. They're like, we're going to have IWW is going to have a general strike. They're going to enforce a general strike. They're going to try to create an alternate government. No problem. We're going to, bring in the American Legion. And actually in Centralia, Oregon, they had the Centralia Massacre, which is this like epic pitched battle between, armed veterans of the American Legion and the Wobblies, the IWW, just intense stuff, right? And so, the thing is basically when Rufo and friends are like, we're going to end DIE and, in universities, we're going to clean all this up. I'm like, you really don't think the like Mississippi state legislature tried some of this stuff in like the 1920s? You really don't think has ever been any attempt to like get communists out of, universities, Hollywood, nobody's thought of, oh my God, wow, there's a lot of progressives in Hollywood. What does that word progressive really mean, right? And you're just like, there's this sort of art of like pulling on this long historical string, just sort of little enough so that it looks like here's this sort of small solvable problem. And, and in conservative fundraising, you're sort of always at this like tipping point. If you give like a little bit more, like you were going to give 20, but you could give 50, right? And if you and everyone else like you gives 50, like we're going to solve this. We're going to, Harvard is going to, get back to teaching only Greek and Latin and theology or something, right? And it's just like I think these people really believe this, but like, or it's like I was talking to someone in DC and basically, outlining my sort of difference between kind of my vision of like, I don't think it can happen in 2025, but, what would have to happen in 2025 of sort of like the difference between crossing the Rubicon and fishing in the Rubicon, right? And the problem is that basically, this isn't, I took the line fishing in the Rubicon from this book by Ernst von Salomon, who was writing in the 20s, Germany in the 20s. And he's like, what I really hate is a sort of German general who basically marches right up to the Rubicon and then sits down and fishes. And so, we're in this sort of strange political season where, like, to raise money on the Republican side or to raise support on the Republican side, you have to kind of fish in the Rubicon. And, that's kind of the state of the art. If you're going to some like trout stream, up in like Nice or something, people are like, oh yeah, Nice is nice, but like, let's go a little south here. Let's, And then they sort of all sit down and fish because they have no idea where they're going. And the result is sort of January 6th was this kind of classic mass fishing of the Rubicon episode where sort of everyone kind of LARPs real regime change. And what do you know? It turns out that you need a license to fish in the Rubicon and go on license for that, mate. It turns out no, they didn't have a license. And that's how that goes on. And so basically, it's like I was talking to this very informed senior person in DC about this Project 2025 stuff and why it can't possibly work. And I'm like, dude, if you accept a political appointment in the second Trump administration, you're looking at an ante of $200,000 in legal bills. Right. You're going to be prosecuted. You're going to be sued. Unless you basically do one thing and one thing only, a craven treasonous thing of doing that and immediately switching sides and spending as long, your whole time in the office, spend that with ingratiating yourself with the permanent staff. By the end, they may consider you almost one of them. And that will make your life much, much easier. And it's obviously the logical, necessary thing to do. Because even if you do this thing of saying, okay, I'm going to actually work for the president in these agencies, and who cares about the legal bills? I have a trust fund, whatever, I happen to be a martyr, if everything goes badly, I'll just burn myself alive on Capitol steps and get public attention, right? Even if you do that, you're not going to get anything done, right? And, there's sort of no possibility of taking this sort of bizarre ship of Washington and actually turning it into what you think you're selling the voters. And yet you have to sell the voters all this Sturm und Drang and drama. And so you're sort of in the worst of these situations where you basically have no choice but to either be lying to people to raise money because that you can't do what they expect you to do with that money, which means you're lying, or basically going to jail, entering into a heinous, undetermined legal process at the end of which you're probably fucked in some way or another. And the real, actually, it's not really a choice between those two things. No, your only choice is both, right? Either that or don't play the game.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real quick, what's the easiest choice you can make? Taking the window instead of the middle seat, outsourcing business tasks that you absolutely hate. What about selling with Shopify? Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US, and Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Whether you're selling security systems or marketing memory modules, Shopify helps you sell everywhere, from their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. I've used it in the past at the companies I've founded, and when we launch merch here at Turpentine, Shopify will be our go-to. Shopify helps turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, up to 36% better compared to other leading commerce platforms. And Shopify helps you sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. With Shopify Magic, whip up captivating content that converts from blog posts to product descriptions. Generate instant FAQ answers. Pick the perfect email send time. Plus, Shopify Magic is free for every Shopify seller. Businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/momentofzen. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
I have a quick question for you. So,
sorry.
No. I think what would be
I ranted too much, but
no.
Please.
For our listeners is so. Have we ever had an executive that's an actual executive? And when was the last time that happened? And then
that was definitely
where did we go wrong? When did we lose the ability to have the executive branch?
So I would say that generally, of course, there's been a fluctuation in these institutions over time. But what you generally see is that DC is, to whatever extent, this is a long it's quite an analogy in some ways, but DC is basically run by an executive like a startup about every 75 or 80 years. So basically, Alexander Hamilton, in a way, when you look at the relationship of Hamilton and Washington, first of all, it's very sort of clearly explicit that the new federal government after the shit show that was the Confederation period is basically set up to be what I would call an accountable monarchy. So you're like, okay, Washington is not going to become like a hereditary king or a military dictator. Many people wanted him to. He's like, okay, we need order. We need a real freaking government here. Like all of the stuff where we're like rebelling against government itself turned out to be just utterly retarded. And so we're going to actually need to create a real federal government. And what they came up with for their founding team by some genius had a lot of resemblance to the sort of co-tenure of like Larry Page and Eric Schmidt at Google. And the Larry Page figure, or the Page and Brin figure is very much Alexander Hamilton, maybe a little bit less of a nerd than those guys and more of a, more Napoleon-like figure in some ways. But like Washington provides the gravitas. Hamilton comes in. He's like this young startup bro. He's working 100-hour weeks. He's the Secretary of the Treasury, but really he's running the whole of Washington. Jefferson is like, I'm the Secretary of State. Why is Hamilton running the State Department, right? He's running the State Department because he's a manager and you're not, and so, I mean, this is a tiny organization by, present day standards. I don't know how many people Hamilton's government had in it. Maybe it was less than 1,000, probably less than 1,000. I don't know. It was small, but, that ran like a real institution. And then the pattern is that these institutions are sort of created and like an aging company, they sort of lose that kind of top-down energy. They get kind of caretaker type management. Who's the guy in charge of Google today? Sundar, right? And right. I'll just keep calling him Pradeep. But, like with Pradeep in charge, like everything just sort of, cruises away on autopilot. He's a peacetime CEO. And if you extend that sort of pattern into, a government which is sort of completely unaccountable and sort of completely arbitrary, you see it becoming oligarchical in various ways. And so constitutional regime becomes this sort of kind of, I guess people in the North would accuse it of having been dominated by the South, which is sort of true for some senses of the word true. But in any case, all of this basically needs to be rebooted when the whole thing explodes in 1860. And in 1860, you see, again, this somewhat federal, sort of ambiguously federal versus national government is really refounded in the federal era in DC in the 1860s. And once again, what you see with this structure is that it has Abraham Lincoln at the top. And Abraham Lincoln is a sort of alpha politician. And he's America's first great politician in some ways. He's just pure politician. He's obviously an autodidact. He sort of takes office with people assuming that he'll kind of be a nobody and like people like Seward and Stanton will be running the regime. That's true to some extent. But Lincoln has these very, very capable team of two private secretaries, John Hay and got his first name, Nicolay. And again, here are these 23-year-old startup bros working 100-hour weeks, basically trying to create new institutions. And that creates sort of, that's sort of the founding moment of like Gilded Age America. And of course, Gilded Age America is founded by this Republican Party, which at the time is the most radical left-wing party in the known universe, basically. And, Marx is a huge admirer of Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a mistake to sort of separate this from, the general kind of political context. Obviously, the North versus the South is left versus right. But when left wins, it basically ossifies sort of into a post-revolutionary structure, rather in the way that the Chinese government, which was once a very revolutionary government, became actually very sort of small c conservative in all possible ways. And so, the rule of the radical Republicans and, of course, the senatorial regime that follows the assassination of Lincoln. I'm still amazed that they haven't tried to re-heroize Thaddeus Stevens, who was kind of de facto running the country for a while. He had very interesting racial views. I guess he had a biracial housekeeper who many people suspected was his mistress. And he was very, very, very insistent on really properly, truly subjugating the South. That didn't work out perfectly. The sort of radical republicanism, collapses really and just becomes what's called the great barbecue of corrupt late 19th century America. And if you walk around American cities, you'll see enormous amounts of stuff was built in this period. It's all relatively beautiful. You've probably heard about how fast the Empire State Building was built. This is the 1870 to 1910 is this Chinese golden age for America, where everything gets done really, really fast. It's insanely competitive. It's insanely corrupt, and nobody's in charge. And this feeling of nobody being in chargeness is sort of what brings about kind of the next revolution in American history, because by the late 19th century, the level of, and you have this element of especially with sort of all the scum of the earth, immigration that's going on there, Irishmen, Italians, Jews, strange things from the Balkans that don't even have names, and all of this H.P. Lovecraft underswell is sucking into these cities, and it's being sucked into these political systems. You probably heard Boss Tweed, you're basically bossism is kind of riding rampant. And Americans of a better social class, sort of maybe, America is still a third world country in some ways at this time. It's obviously a very economically successful third world country, the original developing country, you might say, but it was really developing. And so American elites basically, sort of have always been, slaves to the latest intellectual fashions in Europe and especially in London. And so, the best Americans basically kind of look at these kind of, this is the heyday of kind of our statesmanship in England, this whole new model of universities entwined with the state is being tried in Germany. And at the time, German universities are still sort of the best in the world. So there's a lot of the university model that actually comes from Germany. And these American intellectuals, and, prominently, I always like to, if you remember John Hay, Nixon's secretary from earlier, Hay is later in the sort of McKinley administration becomes kind of the founder of modern U.S. foreign policy as we know it. He's good friends with Henry Adams, who you've probably heard of. They sort of reside in this little group house in D.C., kind of a, rationalist, a dorm equivalent. But in
what was it, a polycule or?
I don't think. They were very close. I don't think they did that in those times, but why did Clover Adams kill herself? We'll never really know. Was it a poly thing going wrong? These things are lost to history. But
it was basically proto-EA.
It was basically proto-EA, right? And Oliver Wendell Holmes is hanging out there, huffing off his vape pen in the bathroom, you can see it, you can picture it. And basically these intellectuals sort of have kind of the common problem of intellectuals, which is, sort of looking at the world and saying in a very EA-like way, because this is basically what EA, or sort of any of these movements boil down to, is you're just looking at the world and saying, wow, the world is fucked. We're so smart. Why aren't we in charge? And, that's sort of the core of early progressivism. Wow, the world is fucked. We're so smart. Why aren't we in charge? And this desire for this kind of natural ruling class to kind of sort of break out of its kind of purely decorative Gilded Age of innocence, rule, and really just like command the full power and resources of the state. It was this undeniable, just the element of aristocracy yearning to break free. I mean, of government, because oligarchy is the expression of an aristocratic of ruling class which feels the right to rule. And oh boy, did these guys feel the right to rule. And so you see that starting to sort of break through, even with Woodrow Wilson, of course, where, the word progressive has been a euphemism for communist, really since the late 1920s. But in the teens, it was not. There was a lot more sort of variety of, in New York City, they were called goo-goos, like good government people, right? And it's sort of all the same thing. So Wilson actually, when he's elected governor of New Jersey, he has to navigate this. Of course, he's elected as Democrat. He has to navigate this insane environment of the New Jersey bosses. And one of the things, and this is kind of inspiring, that early progressives do at this time, is they find the party system. This is where the roots of kind of referring in a derogatory way to the word politics sort of comes from, because basically politics, i.e. democracy, to these people is this disgusting, loathsome thing. And they're we're going to reinvent, the idea of democracy as a sort of golden idol that in practice means that we get, power out of the hands of politicians. And so, so we're going to basically, destroy the village to save it, as you might say. And so, and they go about, doing, with the aid of sort of Walter Lippmann, kind of people are understanding kind of the guidance of public opinion by a media class. Then this is also coming to sort of fruition in the ideas of Walter Lippmann, or even Pulitzer in the early part of the century. All of, everything is sort of bending toward the creation of this Platonic guardian class. And, which is the PMC as we know it today. And, this sort of comes to a head with, yes, Wilson is a progressive, in power, but Wilson doesn't have, and he has a sense of being able to make foreign policy decisions by himself. He doesn't really have the sense of he's not really taking on the old regime. It's, of course, when FDR is elected, and he's elected, in the midst of this sort of insane national crisis, which he kind of does, before his inauguration, which is in March at that time, he actually refuses to cooperate with Hoover in fixing anything at all. FDR is elected on this traditional Democratic platform. You have to remember that the Democrats are the conservative party at this time. If you look at the platform under which FDR is elected, it sort of bears no resemblance to the New Deal at all. He doesn't have a mandate to do what he does. At the same time, he is, a patrician of one of America's greatest, oldest families. He has tremendous self-confidence, and he has this whole movement of all of this basically elite overproduction. He's sort of already started in a way. And he has all of these people that just want to flood into DC and make it this completely new thing. Do you want me to do, I'd sometimes do a little performance of FDR's inaugural address, just the last 10 paragraphs. Do you want that?
I think that would be good. But the one question I have for you is, it feels like this is a criminally understudied part of U.S. history. Well, maybe 1900s.
Well, it's just, it doesn't, I mean, it's certainly studied, but the thing is that when you're studying something, you sort of need a take, and it doesn't really match anyone's take. And so you can basically study, narratives don't just jump out of history. You need to sort of bring the narrative. And this is why you can, we lost Erik. This is why you can, you can write Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States or whatever. I'm sure everything in people's history of the United States, it's like a fact is pretty much like factual, but it tells a very different story than the one I would like to tell. Anyway, I did a performance of this actually at a poetry reading in New York, but one sec.
And then the follow-up question after you do the performance, Curtis, is because I think one thing that comes across in your writing, which I very much agree with, having been in Silicon Valley startups, is the competence of intellectuals relative to people who actually kind of do things. And what's just so puzzling to me is how in that period they somehow were able to kind of jump the fire break from the kind of ivory tower of incompetence.
My favorite example of that is, and it's so remarkable, and people just expect that, they sort of silently and visibly expect that to be true in some ways. My favorite example of this is actually from the UK. It's Lloyd George. So David Lloyd George, of course, radical liberal Welsh statesman, has a traditional English, upbringing, playing fields of Eton, Oxbridge, all of that. No contact with the real world whatsoever, as far as I can determine. And in 1914, the British start this war, and they realize something. They created this war, and they realize something that we've learning all over again, along the Dnieper, which is that for trench warfare, you need a lot of artillery. And in particular, you need a lot of artillery shells. And, the way that the British Army has been, contracting those shells has been very, very inefficient and like little one-offy. So Lloyd George, being a public school boy with no experience in practical matters whatsoever, somehow manages to basically, in like a matter of like 3 or 4 months with no computers, telephones, anything like that, creates a ministry of munitions, which just like mushrooms out of the ground, like these vast factories. No environmental impact statements, of course, but like for creating shells, right? And it's just this amazing demonstration of how, whatever the liberal education of that time was, it actually, I'm sure it staff, et cetera, but it actually created people who could literally do things. Let me read this speech. In a way, I already spoiled it. I did this at the poetry reading and didn't. I was just like, this is not my speech. It's a historical speech from 1933. If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other. That we cannot merely take, but we must give as well. That if we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. Because without such discipline, no progress is made, no leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and property to such discipline, because it makes possible a leadership that aims at a larger good. This I propose to offer, pledging that the larger purposes will bind upon us all as a sacred obligation with a unity of duty hitherto evoked only in time of armed strife. With this pledge taken, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people, dedicated to a disciplined attack. In this image and to this end is feasible under the form of government which we have inherited from our ancestors. Our Constitution is so simple and practical that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in the emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. That is why our constitutional system has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has produced. It is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. I am prepared under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek, within my constitutional authority, to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power, to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me were we in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befit the time. I can do no less. We face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of the national unity, with the clear consciousness of seeking old and precious moral values, with the clean satisfaction that comes from the stern performance of duty by old and young alike. We aim at the assurance of a rounded and permanent national life. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the blessing of God. May He protect each and every one of us. May He guide me in the days to come. End of speech.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are three numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/Zen. That's netsuite.com/Zen to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/Zen.
I think if you
Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Exactly. Franklin Bonaparte, right there, right? Franklin Delano Bonaparte, and what's even more amazing is he does this, right? He's basically just like, I'm going to just, ignore whatever it said about whatever bullshit I said on the campaign trail, and I'm just going to be the CEO of Washington. FDR does not exactly have like one startup bro who's like the fixer for his whole thing. He has 10 or 20. He's got a lot of, imagine, if you could basically just like draft the best like 30, 40, 50 CEOs from like Silicon Valley and just send them to Washington and say, here, you have a basically unlimited budget. You can do anything you want. Go and fuck this. That's a very different thing from making Rex Tillerson the CEO of Exxon, which I'm sure is a very reactive position to begin with, putting him on the 7th floor of the Truman Building and saying, okay, you have the title now. What do you do? Right. The reality is you can't do anything because the real question is, what is U.S. foreign policy? Why do we have a foreign policy? What is this thing? Where did it get there? Right. And that's a question you can ask only if you have this kind of godlike FDR power. I was reading recently the diaries of Harold Ickes, who was FDR's Secretary of the Interior. Like, he's sort of just one of FDR's kind of fixers that he uses to like fix things, right? And he describes cabinet meetings. And his cabinet meetings are really like a C-suite meeting. Like, like they're like, okay, what shit came up this week? Let's talk about, the shit that came up and how to deal with the shit that came up. And, I mean, if you go to like a cabinet meeting today, it's like this ritualized, process which sort of pretends to have some resemblance to an executive process, but in fact is a purely like reactive process, because what you're getting, when you have the issues and decisions that like the leaders in DC deal with now, what you're getting is shit that got, it's essentially exception handling. It's like shit that got kicked up the chain because nobody can sort of handle it as a lower level. So state and DOD need to be coordinated on some like bullshit or whatever. What do we do about the Houthis? Here are your options, Mr. President. There's 3 boxes, like, check the middle one, right? I mean, I love having Biden as president actually for a number of reasons, but, one of them is he really, especially sort of in his like vertiginous mental decline, really symbolizes the absence of like any executive presence in there. The truth is, he doesn't need to not have Alzheimer's, right? Actually, the system works better if he has Alzheimer's and just does what he's told, right? And so trust the process, right? Oh, this is absolutely what anyone who understands how anything works believes in DC. They believe in like trust the process. I'm like, well, the problem with trust the process is that I trusted the process of like virology, and then it turned out that they were basically like, inventing COVID, to get more grants, and not for any like nefarious purpose to take over the world or just to get more grants, except some of them were on the like Chinese side of the fence and like the Chinese military. Maybe there was some Chinese military involvement. And why was the Chinese military doing this? To get more grants. Like, that's just the way.
Maximizer, you don't need to worry about.
Yeah. Worry about the grant maximizer. Worry about when the AIs start to get into grant writing. That's when you really, I'm sure the AIs are already very deep into grant writing. So, the grant writing was made for AIs, and so you have
way to prevent AGI, give grant AI tenure.
Yeah, that's right. You'd have to nationalize it all under the Department of Artificial Intelligence, and after 50 years, you'd have like ELIZA, right? And you could actually make the field go backward. But yeah, like it's sort of like this is what I get, from a Silicon Valley perspective, and then from a Silicon Valley perspective again. When I imagine, okay, how does this thing need to be reorganized? It's just absolutely ridiculous that if you were fixing, an institution like this, which basically makes IBM look like SpaceX, right? And it makes Boeing look like SpaceX, right? It's just absurd that you would basically be like, okay, let's try to fix this thing within its existing policies, procedures, and whatever. No, you'd basically like create a new thing. Right. This is just the normal startup way of doing something. You create a new thing. And like, I sort of, outlined to this senior person, like what would creating a new thing look like. And he sort of had 2 criticisms of my approach. One of them was the sort of obvious one of like, well, if this doesn't work, we all go to jail. And I'm like, well, yeah, the problem is you go to jail for crossing the Rubicon, but if you don't go directly to Rome after that and take Rome. But, these days you also go to jail for fishing in the Rubicon. So the thing is, if you can't fish in the Rubicon, then you can't, be in this business at all. So it's basically go big or go home. And, the sort of everything, all of this logic is, Caesar himself crosses the Rubicon because if he basically doesn't, he gets like, tried and executed basically in Rome. Right. And so he really has no choice. To compare Donald Trump to Caesar is ridiculous, of course, in many ways. But sort of the system is unconsciously setting up these same kinds of dynamics. I think, unfortunately, the sort of Project 2025 of like the real Trump administration has never been tried, thing kind of has to be tried to show how badly it will work. And at that point, people will sort of see my like kind of obvious observation here. But the thing that was striking about this conversation was that, like the person I was talking to didn't at all disagree of like my version of Washington or how Washington works or like any of that. You just sort of couldn't quite see that step to know we're doing this over again. But the second thing that was even more interesting, there's this sort of obsession, on the Rubicon fishing right now with like, how do we get the right people? How do we find, people who are like ideologically committed, but like willing to, capable, and they know DC as well. And I'm like, okay, you've just created like a Venn diagram with like 5 circles there, and the intersection between them was like 3 people, right? And I was like, okay, here's what you do if you get elected president in, 2029 or whatever. You're like, I don't have an executive branch. You elected me to be chief executive. I'm going to start creating an executive branch. I'm going to basically avoid the whole appropriations process by funding this directly out of the Fed. And, I was like, wow, how was Jerome Powell going to, allow that? And I'm like, well, an hour after you're inaugurated, sir, Jerome Powell's like card key doesn't work anymore. His badge won't even let him into the building. Like, that's basically how. And then you're like, okay, because, the Federal Reserve, we have this soft currency, right? And the thing is, if you look at the Federal Reserve, you're trying to restore executive authority here. You look at the Fed and you're like, well, this is part of the government, so it's obviously described by the Constitution, right? So I'm like Constitution, I'm looking at the Constitution here. I'm like, well, I don't see it. I don't see it in Article 1, so it's clearly not part of the legislative branch. I don't see it in Article 3, so it's clear. I know, it's part of the executive branch. That means I'm in charge of it. That means basically, as soon as I'm elected president, I can go over to the Eccles building and basically print a bunch of money to fund myself to do whatever the fuck I want. Right? The Constitution basically says that. So you're like, okay, then you're saying in a very, very explicit way. Did we lose Erik? Was this too heavy for
Erik kind of goes in and out with his camera. I mean, okay. He's got that special, tube-based camera.
Yeah, I got it. The tube's overheated, right? And so you're like, okay, I'm in this sort of startup, situation where I'm creating a new government from scratch. Whoa, that's like really, really heavy. But who would I rely on to do it? And, I'm just like, okay, call Sam Altman, right? And I'm pretty sure Sam Altman has a pretty big Rolodex of people who know how to get shit done and scale it at a very, very rapid speed. There's sort of only one problem, which is that they're all gay shitlips. And I'm just like, you have to realize that this is not a problem. And, this is sort of the most important thing to realize about regime change, is that you're thinking of regime change as this like radical ideological thing. And it's not. It's not at all an ideological thing. It is the opposite of an ideological thing. It is absolutely the end of ideology. And the guy who really realized this was Napoleon. And Napoleon basically, as you may know, started out as a revolutionary general. He was a Jacobin. He was in there. He wasn't like, quite in there doing reign of terror stuff, but that was the side he was on. And he basically realizes that France has this vacuum of effective authority. He makes himself like first consul, like we're like LARPing the Romans. And so Napoleon basically has this concept of the career open to talents, which basically means it didn't matter what side you were on in the revolution. If you wanted to work for Napoleon, you just had to be good. And the thing is, when you have an organization which is a process-based, reactive organization, the way DC today actually works, it is very, very true that personnel are policy, and that, you have these ridiculous procedures that sort of get manipulated and subverted by people like Fauci who actually know how to command the system. You can't fire Fauci, replace him with someone else and expect them to have the power of Fauci, because it's all this power comes out of these informal networks, these like Byzantine processes in which no one is ever personally responsible for decisions. Terrible way to run a railroad. I mean, and we see just, even a hint of that in the way like sort of Boeing or United Launch Alliance or whatever works. You compare that to SpaceX, and like there's a difference in effectiveness of like 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. Even when you compare SpaceX to Blue Origin, they're both startup space. But Elon was like, okay, I'm going to build space the way, I'm just going to, use the literature, build all of my processes from scratch, do everything, faster, cheaper, like, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to make a sort of space industry instead of a space, one-off thing. I ran into, there was a very interesting, yes.
Oh, I was going to say, did you happen to read the biography at all, or get any of the bits and pieces?
Yeah, I did. I don't know. They're not I haven't read the Ashley Vance one. But go on.
The thing I thought was most interesting in the Isaacson thing is his process in terms of just if you were to go run the government. The first thing he asks everyone is, where did this requirement come from and who is responsible for it? Imagine trying to do that in the government.
No,
right?
There's no way you could try to do that with government, because basically that's like, that's like a sort of, from a management standpoint, preventing this sort of process, bulking up from happening is sort of like cleaning your room. But it's saying like, okay, we're going to keep our room clean, and then you basically take, and then you go to fresh kills landfill and you try to apply it. It just makes no sense. You wouldn't start with these organizations, right? And you wouldn't even start with the people. And Jeff Bezos makes the mistake when he wants to create private space of starting with the people from NASA, Boeing, whatever, and he creates this giant clusterfuck that doesn't get anything done. Whereas when you look at, who wrote this? There was someone, I think that old AutoCAD guy in Switzerland, what's his name? One of the AutoCAD founders, who's kind of an intellectual, wrote this piece about space in the 1990s, where he's like, do you know who invented the liquid-fueled rocket? That's right, Nazis. And so basically the US space program was essentially the Nazi space program, as you probably know, right? So and he's like, let's look at this Nazi space program. Okay, they're Nazis, but they were churning out these liquid fueled ballistic rockets, not orbital rockets, but still, and they're making 10 of them a day. In fucking 1944 while being bombed to shit by the U.S. Air Force. Okay, yeah, you're using slave labor at a certain level. I mean, people who work at SpaceX are pretty committed too, and they're not exactly being starved to death in underground tunnels, but it probably feels like that occasionally. And they had a rocket industry going in the 1940s. Why couldn't we do this again? And now we have this again, right? And so, the way of operating when you're operating an effective organization, first of all, having a command-based organization really can be 10 to 100 to 1,000 times more effective than a process-based organization. And also, in a command-based organization, it actually doesn't matter what your employees think, because they quickly develop loyalty to the organization. And, SpaceX, when SpaceX decides, okay, our new rocket is going to be, methylox instead of kerosene, it isn't like, oh, wow, what do all the engineers at SpaceX think about propellants? You've got the kerosene party and the methylox party, and they're they won't even eat lunch, at the same table or something. They're always fighting each other. And you're just this is a methylox shop. No, that's a top-down decision. If Elon decides his rockets are going to run on Elmer's glue, right? Basically, in 2.5 years, we're going to see an Elmer's glue powered rocket, shooting out of Cape Canaveral, right? And if it's possible, I suppose, does that shit even burn? But, the effectiveness of a sort of truly top-down organization, which runs on the principle of what the military calls mission orders, where basically your boss has a mission to solve. His goal is to execute on his mission. You know, you work for him. He breaks the mission into pieces, and he's like, go get this sub-mission done. But I'm not going to tell you how to do it because that would be micromanagement. And whereas in DC, everyone at every level is basically there to run a process. And maybe if the process doesn't fit or has to be changed or has to be adjusted, sort of the idea is you're trying to get rid of the human factor at every level. And the result is a system in which, you know, sort of there's still power. It's just swirling around these informal networks, and personnel is policy. And the thing is, if you're actually basically coming in to Washington to create a startup government, to say, okay, we're just shutting all this stuff down. Maybe there are little pieces that we can reuse. Maybe like the Coast Guard just needs to be like overhauled instead of dissolved, right? You know, but like, you know, the National Transportation Safety Board, you know, they're basically there's effective uncorrupted parts of the U.S. government. You don't want to get too enthusiastic about sort of declaring them. One thing you can do is basically take existing employees and just give them IQ tests and recycle them into like areas of expertise that are totally distant from whatever they were doing last time. You know, if you have a lack of personnel, I don't really think you need a lot of people to actually run a modern government. And, you know, but the thing is, when you're talking about doing this for real, you're just like, you find yourself asking questions. Why exactly does this country have 50 DMVs? Do we need 50 DMVs? Is there like, the states are the laboratories of democracy? That's right. Because, you know, we have this sort of different way of driving that we do in Maryland as opposed to California. Like who the fuck would design this? Like, why do we need these state governments, right? In a time when basically these are just abstract lines on a map. These used to have, you know, people used to be more attached to these lines on the map than they are attached to like, they're like countries in Western Europe today, but now they're just lines on the map. Or they're like, you know what they are is like where people have a real like political loyalty and really express pride is college football. Right. So, you know, and I think that when you take down a lot of these universities, like you're going to want to keep parts of them. And certainly you're going to want to keep like a lot of some of the STEM labs, you know, can sort of be preserved. But also the college football teams. I think some of these are great programs, like, you know, Ohio State, you know, University of Florida. You know, these are things that should not vanish, you know, in any regime change. These are kind of glories of the American spirit. And I think, you know, it'll just be like they have these names that are associated with these colleges that used to exist, but like it's just a historical thing, you know. And like I still think that, you know, the Gators can play on, you know, even after Florida State
went to Michigan. Michigan.
Yeah. Exactly. And it sometimes feels like, you know, history is just almost getting ready to make that call, right? You know, and so, you know, when you talk about basically coming to the problem with this kind of Ataturk energy, I guess I would say. I had a good podcast appearance with, you know, Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. That's one of my favorite podcast appearances, actually, because, you know, Cenk is he's a bully, he's an idiot, he's a communist, and he's a Turk. And I was like, you know, for some reason he asked me to go on his show, and I was like, okay, I'll go on and just make friends with him. And like, I tried to bond over Ataturk, you know, and I think it worked rather well. And the, you know, most Americans don't understand the Ataturk reference, you know, but they do understand the FDR reference, and they do kind of understand that FDR, they wouldn't necessarily use the word dictator. It has this opprobrium, but, you know, they sort of look at the time and they're just like, wow, I have a real sense that this person was really in charge of the government, as he was. And he was also a good FDR, although he had many Trump-like, you know, characteristics, was also a good manager. More specifically, he was good at delegating, which is something, unfortunately, that Donald is really bad at. So, you know, how we get here is essentially, you know, FDR wins in 1933. He becomes dictator for life. He sort of immediately starts trying to reorganize the whole country and also take over the world. or the whole government and take over the world. He does a lot of things. He has trouble really, like his power isn't really absolute. And so he has trouble with it takes time and really a war for him to take over a lot of the oldest sort of refuges of the old regime. Like, you might not know this, but in the 30s and 40s, probably the most conservative part of the U.S. government is actually the State Department. And so he has to basically sort of, it's complicated, but of course he succeeds in turning it into what it is now. But in 44, he's running for president again because he's president for life, obviously, and he knows he's dying. Actually, everybody around him knows he's dying. The American public doesn't even know he's in a fucking wheelchair, but everyone around FDR knows he's dying. And who does he pick? And so his vice president in 1940 is, of course, Henry Wallace, who is, sort of as close to a pure shitlib as we would see in these halls until Bernie Sanders, except that Wallace is an even more sort of an older aristocratic type of American shitlib because he's not even Jewish. And he's a progressive. He would later run in 48 after the split between the pro-Soviet, between, American communists and Soviet communists. He would run as a pro-Soviet communist in the 1948 election, which was really remarkable because it allowed us to count the number of communist shitlibs in America. And I think it was between 1 and 2 million who voted for Wallace in 48. But Wallace was absolutely committed to turning America into what it is now. But instead of Wallace, who's like a real figure, he picks this guy, Harry Truman. And Harry Truman is basically kind of a nobody. He's a machine politician from St. Louis. He's in the hands of the Pendergast mob. He's a nobody. He's not even really a New Dealer. And people are like, why does FDR pick fucking Harry Truman? And, there was a lot of in politics in it, but fundamentally, it brings me back to, there's a story of the death of Alexander the Great. This story, he's dying, he's 31 years old, he's conquered the world. All of his thugs, all of his guys are around him. He's clearly on his deathbed, and they all have one question, and it's the obvious question. My lord, who does your empire go to? And he looks at them, he takes one last breath, and he says, Tokratos, which means the strongest. And then he dies. And such is the story in any case. And that's how it goes down, and with FDR, it's a little bit different. FDR is this American pharaoh. He's a world pharaoh. He's conquered the world because he still thinks of Stalin as his strong right arm, right? He thinks of Stalin as his guy up to his death. And after his death, one of the things that the people left in charge, like Tokratos, realizes, no, actually Stalin is really not our guy and was never our guy. And we thought we were using him, but he thought he was using us. That realization, Washington is still conscious enough at that time for it to change its mind and understand that, because being anti-Soviet in DC or London in 44 was the kiss of death. And so they execute this. Stalin basically forces them to realize this. But, he dies, and Truman, who I guess he didn't even know about the atomic bomb project, is nobody, is basically, put behind FDR's desk. And the result of that is that FDR basically controlled the administration through all of these informal wires and all of this, kind of prestige and political, horse trading and everything. And then you get this nobody in charge, and all of this, all of these cords snap. And instead of having, sort of central power in the White House over the executive branch, power just goes, it's like cutting the steering wheels, the cables from the wheel of a giant ship. Just power goes poof, right back down into the engines. And it will never be seen in the White House again. And anyone who gets elected there basically has to surf, off of the tremendous pool of competence that is the deep state. And the deep state is essentially just, FDR's personal regime 75 years later. That's all that we're looking at. You know, it's FDR's personal regime, which by electing, you know, choosing a nobody to succeed him, basically he made it permanent. Because basically he didn't leave any of that pharaonic power lying around for his successor. And the thing is, you got to understand, these guys were good. These guys were startup quality guys. They really know how to get shit done. Okay, yeah, you know, like maybe in retrospect, they shouldn't have conquered the world with the assistance of the Soviet Union. Maybe that was a bad idea, but they did that, you know, and then what are you going to do with that? Well, now you have two competing revolutionary empires instead of one. You got to steal the British and French empires and destroy them. And, you know, sort of life goes on from there. Actually, my favorite example from this historical period that I saw this was in 15, 20 years ago even. I'm reading just really scurrilous South African blogs and trying to sort of make sense of the world in a way that makes no sense to me. And I come across this reference, a lady researcher at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace developed a military plan for a joint U.S.-Soviet invasion of South Africa. And I was like, what the fuck? Can you imagine like the Marines and the Red Army like joining hands in the Transvaal, you know, like insane, like retro stuff. And so I'm like, this can't possibly be true. I'm going to find it. And I found it. I basically interlibrary loaned this document from the Carnegie Endowment from 1960 called South Africa and United Nations Collective Measures. And it is true that the military plan was only the last chapter. Like before that, there were various sanctions, et cetera, that were going to be imposed on this racist fascist regime, right? And basically, I think about it from the perspective of the author. It's 1960. It's, you know, 15 years later. You're like, let's get the band back together, right? And go kick some more Nazi ass, right? That's all that they're thinking. It's completely logical now that sort of time has passed for that sort of thinking. But has it really? Because Mandela, you know, and the ANC are both basically on the U.S. payroll and the Soviet payroll at the same time. Mandela is actually, after his death, acknowledged to have been on the Politburo of the SACP. And, like, actually, no, they actually basically did that. They just didn't do it in a super dramatic way. And you know, the U.S. and the USSR are also on the same side in the Suez Crisis in 1956. When it comes to ending colonialism, right? And so, you know, this whole, you know, when you basically sort of plug those things together into that narrative, and especially when you see the fundamental story of the U.S.-Soviet relationship as these are two cousins, which are actually much closer to each other in some ways than even Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and, you know, they have a more effective alliance than Nazi Germany and fascist Italy for that, you know, certainly, not to mention Germany and Japan. That, like, I mean, you look at a map and you're like, in 1941, if like Germany goes this way and Japan goes that way, the war is over and we're in Philip K. Dick world. Why doesn't that happen? Right. And so, you know, you're sort of revisiting these like really large questions of like, how did history end up here? What is this thing actually like? And once you start rebuilding these very different kinds of narratives, like you're much more like, think about how different this is from the like sort of cartoon Marvel movie, you know, George Washington and the cherry tree story of like American history. And even conservatives are sort of caught like deeply in this history, and they sort of don't really understand how thin the like legitimacy and self-confidence of this regime is. They don't understand how much, you know, like progressives they don't believe in law. They don't believe in rules. They believe in outcomes, right? And so when they start waving around, oh my God, you broke the law. You broke the law. Like, you trespassed on Capitol grounds, into the oubliette for you, like, rats will be eating your toes for the next 10 years. You broke the law. We're a law-abiding country. We respect the law in this country, right? And you're just like, yeah, no, really, I just can't really take that very seriously. And I can take it seriously in terms of you having power, but the thing is, breaking, it's the things that, like, I mean, it's just like, historians from a different time will be like utterly baffled. There'll be like, Donald Trump has 75 million supporters and at least 25 million of them are armed. Like, who could resist that? Like, how could that lose, right? It would just snap a finger and, like, we'd be jailing those radicals and red agitators again, and like,
let me ask you a question on that.
So, Curtis, I'm curious. Yes. Go ahead, Erik, if you have one. I have one.
Right, so, Curtis,
I think I'm done ranting here, so you can fire away.
The rants are good.
The rants are
good. You concede that we're making progress here. Like, the venture capital startup approach is always start something new. Elon didn't start a new Twitter; he took over Twitter. Would you concede that Elon has had some success in making in doing an actual takeover of Twitter? And why couldn't that happen with some of these other institutions like Harvard? You just take over the board, boom, new.
You take over. I think it's, first of all, I don't think the Twitter thing has been all that well done or conceived. But more generally, the problem with limited or incremental steps, like, my favorite example of this was when I was talking to some rich crypto person, and he's like, what if our friends just buy the Times or the Post or something like that? Right? It's a company. You can buy it, right? I'm like, well, actually, the Times is not a company. It's a fifth-generation hereditary monarchy with a special share structure set up to keep the precious blood of the Sulzbergers, in charge. But setting that aside, okay, what if you buy the?
They did super voting shares before the tech bros.
I know. I mean, in a way, we're still a monarchy because the most prestigious and powerful institution in the country is a fifth generation absolute hereditary monarchy. Like, actually, the real problem with the Times is not that it's a monarchy. It's that, Punch or Bitch or Pinch or whatever the latest Sulzberger's name is actually a weak king. And that's the sort of the cause of a lot of, like, woke craziness of the Times, is the weakness of the latest Sulzberger. And, again, nobody associates this with, politics, my God. Right. But the thing is, if you buy the Washington Post, the way Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos doesn't own the Washington Post. He sponsors the Washington Post because it only appears to be a top-down organization. Actually, the Times is the sort of the last of the organizations where the publisher, through, like, his historical droit de seigneur, sort of actually controls the news desk. I don't think that A.G. Sulzberger gets to, like, bang any hot reporters he wants, but, probably he does anyway. And the probably if you're a girl reporter and get hired at the Times, they're just like, if A.G. comes by, like, just, let things happen, just don't. But I'm sorry, AG. This is total. I'm joking. This is not slander in any way. And I'm sure he's a very chaste man. And the probably doesn't even do coke. And so what would happen if you took over the board of Harvard, or you bought the Washington Post or any of these things, is you would realize that it was not a top-down organization. And you would basically, the way in which you would realize that it is not a top-down organization is you would basically take, how progs, how irritating it is that these people pretend to be the underdog all the time when they actually have all the fucking power in the world. Give them a chance to actually be the underdog in any way, shape, or form. I mean, having Trump as president did this. Suddenly, they all like, they want to feel like rebels, all these like wine-ons drinking their Chardonnay, and suddenly they're just like, and they're not just wine-ons drinking Chardonnay, they're holding a cell, they're the resistance, they're gonna, Marie Louise, where should we put the bombs on the track to stop, the Trump's panzers, we must like, like it's crazy. And like the revenues of the Times, like I think doubled or tripled during the Trump administration. Revenues of the ACLU went 10x, up 10x, because these resistance organizations are actually, they're going to need to function. They're going to need to protect us against Trump's handmaid's tale, Trumpenreich, that he's about to, right? And of course, Trump, meanwhile, just kind of wants to be on TV and thinks being president will be good for his brand, and has some like old opinions from like 1955 because he remembers 1955, right? And that's all that you're looking at there, right? And so the thing is, what you're doing when you like, imagine how far taking over the board of Harvard, the board of overseers or something. Great name. And have they thought about changing that? Like, because that's like, I think they were getting rid of the word master, but like, I think overseer, was a little like, you're just like, why am I getting this like Django Unchained vibe here, right?
Master branch and GitHub canceled. Master bedroom.
Yeah.
Board of
Master
overseers.
bedroom. Board of overseers. Oh yeah. And not only is Harvard, not only is the New York Times an absolute hereditary monarchy, which we definitely need to keep because it's the newspaper of record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's also the case that, sort of definitions of slavery vary. I don't know if you've read the great philosopher Robert Nozick's Tale of a Slave. You'll find that, you have this word, actually, you can't even say slaved anymore. They'll probably have to change it in future editions of Anarchy and Utopia and State. They'll have to say the tale of an enslaved person. And one of the definitions of slavery, of course, or one of the forms of slavery is debt slavery. Y'all are familiar with debt slavery, right? You work in the company town, like, well, you got to pay off this, you borrowed your tools from the master, from the main, you borrowed your tools from the main branch. You have got a debt to the main branch. You've got to pay that off. And one of the boundaries between, is this debt slavery, or is it not debt slavery, is, of course, the modern institution of bankruptcy. Debts are dischargeable in bankruptcy. You don't go to the Fleet prison if you can't pay your debts the way you did in London in the 1680s. And so we don't have debt slavery. We don't have debt slavery in America because we have a very effective bankruptcy system, and debts can be discharged by anyone in bankruptcy, with one exception. And who gets that exception? Oh my gosh, it's Harvard! And
Board of Overseers.
The Board of Overseers basically are like going to make you pick cotton until you pay off them student loans, And so, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? The Board of Overseers. But suppose you manage to capture the Board of Overseers, and you get your guys on the Board of Overseers, and they start like overseeing. And they're doing that overseeing. They're cracking the whip. They're like, we're going to pick something else in cotton today. We're going to go out and plant, Belgian endive, instead of cotton, and we're going to pick these endives, right? And what you'll find is that basically, first of all, you just like the number of people at Harvard you need to shoot if you're really, let's say you're actually trying to de-woke-ify Harvard. Okay. What that means is that basically you're trying to get rid of progressivism at Harvard just as thoroughly as if the progressives took over Harvard and it was a racist school from top to bottom, scientific racism, the Nordic, everything celebrated, everything had gone full Madison Grant. And like you have just, you have whole departments of scientific racism. Physical anthropology is the queen of the sciences there at Harvard. Also, when you're hiring a professor, you want to look into, is he of a good Nordic stock? Does he have the right, opinions? any trace of like, has he praised the 8-hour workday at some point? Because, I know who else praises the 8-hour workday. That's right. Communists, right? Any kind of homosexuality, of course, right. And so when you're imagining de-woke-ifying Harvard to the same extent that basically progressives would want to purge, Madison Grant style, like H.P. Lovecraft, 1930s, Nordic scientific racism, whatever the fuck. Obviously, we've learned a lot about race science since then. But I'm not going to suggest that, they didn't even know what DNA was, right? So, what you're seeing is that the correct historical, if you're actually trying to do that, then the correct historical analogy, there's really only one really good one, which is the denazification of Germany. And if you go and look at what we did at the denazification of Germany, and you're imagining applying that treatment to Harvard, first of all, there's no point in applying it only to Harvard. No, denazification was across the entire society. And basically, it just it restructured kind of the structure of status and honor in that society such that any association with the National Socialist German Workers' Party was a huge black mark on your career. And any participation in, resistance of any kind was a huge, merit, right? If you're talking about reconstructing Harvard under those terms, okay, and, for example, like, they, in 45, they're like, we're going to destroy all Nazi architecture. If there's a building that looks too Nazi, they actually pulped all the Nazi books. They're like, literally, we are going to take the output of Nazi publishing and we're not going to burn it for the camera. No, we're going to like fucking pulp it and make toilet paper out of it. Right. That level of, they really came in with like full Stalin energy. Oh, no, we want these people to be, compliant. So we're going to just like starve them and keep them on 800 calories a day. I don't think it was excessive. Right. It was excessive, but they were really determined not to err on the side of not doing enough. And as a result, Germany is like the most docile country in the world today. They barely have teeth. They can barely even eat tofu, right? And like from this nation of like, conquering carnivores, like you have this just profoundly, it's amazing they can even reproduce, right? And if you're talking about basically doing that to wokeness at Harvard, okay, that's one thing. You install this new like board of overseers, you get some real throwback overseers up there, guys where like Jeff Davis would be like, that's a little bit extreme, Patrick there, and get them to oversee the new Harvard. All of that energy of like, I'm resisting this. Like, it's just like you're doing something small and weak. And when you do something small and weak, like nobody is on your side. The best answer to this, there's a famous, should be more famous, I guess. There was a conversation in 1942 when the U.S. Where did the U.S. invade first in 1940? What was the first country the U.S. invaded in World War II?
Italy? Or
Morocco.
Africa?
Morocco.
Yeah.
Morocco. Obviously Morocco. Right. Yeah. And so the U.S. basically, in Operation Torch, invades North Africa because Pearl Harbor. Right. And so if you're like, where did the idea of invading Iraq for 9/11 come from? It's like, okay, this is real American tradition. Because of Pearl Harbor, we invade North Africa. North Africa is part of this interesting idea that the Germans had, which was a really stupid idea of like, let's create like Vichy France, which will be France, but kind of friendly with us, but kind of neutral, but like kind of friendly with us. Casablanca, right. So, basically, in order, and the French have a considerable sort of military there, but that military, of course, was, used to being on our side in World War I. Of course, the British did this insane thing where as soon as France falls in Iran, they basically just like attack and destroy the like French Navy in North Africa. So it's complicated, right? And there's some bad blood there. So this American OSS guy goes ashore in a little boat and he lands and he goes to the French general in charge of North Africa. And he's like, just hypothetically, if we did, I'm not saying, but if we did come ashore, what would you do? And the general's like, well, that depends. If you send a company, we'll kill them. If you send an army corps, we'll fight them. And if you send a whole army, if we'll surrender to them. And in fact, we'll join them. And the thing is, basically, when you act with a small amount of power sort of naturally goes to everybody wants to be on the winning team. Everybody always wants to be on the winning team. That is their deepest, that is a desire that is far more fundamental than ideology. It's the way in which everyone in Germany and Japan in 1945 goes from being a fanatical Nazi to a fanatical democratic socialist. Everyone wants to be on the winning team. And so when you act weakly with power, there's this old British from back when, the old Ministry of Munitions days when the British could actually run things. There's this British metaphor, which is grasping the nettle. Have you heard about this? So a nettle is a stinging plant. Ever been stung by a nettle? It really fucking hurts. Supposedly, I'd love for one of you guys to go off and try this. Supposedly, if you grab a nettle firmly, you compress the stalking, you compress the little injectors, and so it actually doesn't sting you. So if you grasp it firmly, you can just pull it up. But if you brush against it, it's going to make you feel the pain. Right? And power is like that. And so basically, when you sort of act in these kind of weak, marginal kinds of ways, it's almost like what Rufo is doing, at least, with trying to get someone who's basically disposable. And how many Claudine gays are there? They're, attriting the population of Claudine gays. Is that a win? Is that you're like, this is my strategy of attrition, it will take approximately 50,000 years. Right. And what you're basically doing when you do that, okay, he sort of played by the rules to some extent. He didn't try to use any kind of new forms of power. He just, got enough kind of shaming energy there that this person became a liability and had to be thrown under the bus. Good for his fundraising. Not really a step toward taking over the Harvard Board of Overseers. And I don't know what it takes. I think Harvard is now part of Pritzker run America, right? What does it take to get the Pritzkers in jail, right? And really, what does it take to get the Pritzkers in jail? Because I'm sure they're guilty of something, everybody's guilty of something. That's what we're finding out with this sort of new.
You don't build a hotel fortune without a few broken eggs.
Exactly. Right.
They didn't build a fortune. It was inherited.
They inherited it. Right. I'm sure there's something, and maybe some election tampering and who knows? It's just this is one of the things about sort of America's shit-lib empire is that what you see with stuff in the Hunter Biden, corruption world. At this point, the Clinton Foundation stuff was pretty brazen, but the way the Bidens operated, they just realized that nobody's looking. Nobody's going to prosecute them. Nobody cares. They can do whatever the fuck they want. And even when the fucking New York Post is reports on them, they're who cares? It's the New York Post. That's not even a real newspaper. And what influence does the New York Post have? Who, right? It's all a paper tiger.
And it's real now. They just wait a year and they said, yeah, it was real.
Yeah. Yeah, who cares? Who cares? It's like admitting that Mandela was actually on the South African Politburo. It's Coventry Patmore territory, the truth.
I want to go back to one thing about, so if we take kind of the mainstream right, or this idea that we're going to win victories, here or there.
These little victories. Yeah.
And you point out that kind of okay, if you are disconnected from just basic history and just a study of the understanding of how does power work, where is that disconnect? Because what I feel is what I see from the right is a little bit of like, they kind of grew up under the Marvel version of American history as well.
Sure.
And it kind of is like, oh, well, everything is Schoolhouse Rock. So if we just follow the set of rules and we win and we get the institutions, we're now in charge.
And we make our bill become a law.
Yeah, where's the disconnect of, ostensibly these people are intelligent and truth-seeking, yet all this other kind of information is out there, and there's a pretty wide gap between where you are and where they are. And so where do you attribute that difference?
Jumping that gap is really hard. And, because the thing is, it's old. It's not a new, like, one of my favorite little historical examples is that in 1940, I don't know exactly how the internals of this, but are you familiar with the concept of Nimrod Randhawa, also known as Nikki Haley? You know how you ever see that movie Mean Girls? They're trying to like make Nikki Haley a thing, and I'm like, Nikki Haley's not going to happen, right? Stop pretending Nikki Haley's is going to happen. It's not going to happen. But the thing is, the ability to sort of this kind of Republican machine to like make Nikki Haley happen goes back to the times when two things you've got to remember. One is that the Republicans actually were originally the old left-wing Boston patrician party. And so even in FDR's day, there's a lot of like progressive Republican energy because he basically made, it would be as if like Trump managed to run, well, maybe RFK Jr., right? If like somehow Trump managed to put a populist in charge of the Democrats so that somehow it was a populist versus populist, election. I actually like the way Fetterman seems to be growing a new brain. Maybe we could use him. I think it would be amazing to run a joke Fetterman campaign and just like meme Fetterman 24 energy, right? But the thing is, one of the classic ways of stealing an election is basically to run your guy on both parties, right? And the amazing thing is that in 1940 with Wendell Willkie, this was done. In fact, Willkie only became a Republican in 1940. He'd been a Democrat. And they FDR basically chose a member of his own party to run against him in the general election. Moreover, they agreed on the same basic point, which was, internationalism or like American world domination, right? There was, so they managed in the 1940 election, they managed to put two anti-isolationist candidates in the election against, what polling would tell you was like an 80 to 85% isolationist America. Okay. Once that's done, like when something like that happens, the idea that you're like gonna get back to like democracy without like sort of acknowledging that like, okay, that thing happened. 48, same thing, or 52 rather. In 48, they basically, Eisenhower, who's a New Deal political general, who was basically a colonel when he started the war and was basically yanked with George Marshall up the ladder because he seemed like a competent staff officer and his politics were right. I think he just followed Milton Eisenhower's lead, basically. In 1948, he's spoken of as a Democratic candidate. In 52, he somehow appears on the Republican ballot. And he's like, Ike, oh yeah, Ike, the really America, right? And of course, he basically, cements the nature of the New Deal as a permanent bipartisan thing by like muscling out the last sort of real old Republican who was Taft. And so you've got to understand that in a world where, the Schoolhouse Rock thing has been fake literally for even the lifespan of the oldest fucking boomer in Arizona, right? Acknowledging that and acknowledging that, like, no, the system is not and has never been the real thing that people claim it is, and is like this sort of enormous it's like a quantum, sort of barrier that needs to be leaped over. And I think the best sort of tropes in today's political world are the things that are just kind of disconnecting or just alienating people from this sort of crazy like frame. But the more you sort of take it seriously and believe it's real, the problem is that you basically remember the Tea Party, not their original Tea Party, which was like an Antifa riot, but like the Tea Party of like 15 years ago. They're like, oh, we're going to throw the deep state in the tea or something like that, right? And you get all these people excited. They're going to do something. They're going to elect whatever, and nothing happens. And it's like you have this, or in France, the Gilets jaunes, which, finally got killed by COVID. They were like, France is always, if we can get enough people in the street, like the government in France will change. They get enough people in the street, nothing happens. They're like, we'll do it again. Act 2, bigger and better. They're on to like Act 56 by the time like COVID happens, and like nothing happens. This is the way to generate the phenomenon in psychology known as learned helplessness, where you basically, you present people with what user interface experts call an affordance. You're like, here's a knob, turn the knob, anything will happen. You're in power, the people are in charge, the people can turn the knob, right? You turn the knob, nothing happens. You're like, why didn't that work? But you fiddle with the knob, you're like, oh, it's like the closed door button on the elevator, right? And so, what you have still, with all of these kind of, whether it's Rufo or Trump or whatever, they're all just like furiously stabbing the closed door button as if it's going to work. And there's this sort of sense also that they have sort of this sense of like snowballing, where you're just like, they know they're in the right. America is basically built on the just world fallacy. And that's like Amendment 0 is the just world fallacy. And they're like, why, in this great country with this great political system, best in history, nobody else in history has anything to teach us at all, but why is everything broken? I'm like, well, if you can get like one little crystal of like shit working properly, then it's like a super saturated solution of brokenness. And like the just world theory, it's not a fallacy, it's a theory, will reassert itself. The just world law will reassert itself. God will act, and then everything will become like right. So it's like, the new college thing in Florida, that shit show is such a great example of it, where they're like, okay, we're going to take over this like shitty little Florida version of Reed College, which somehow the governor has the power to control, and we're going to put it in the hands of conservatives, and it's going to become... And, it's just like, dude, if you want to create a new thing, create a new thing. And, what actually happened there, what's currently happening is they basically said, well, who are we even going to get to apply to the next, semester of new college, when basically all of the like hippie intellectuals, whether students or professors, have fled. And the answer that they came up with was, I believe, baseball players. They're like, okay, the nerds are out, so the future of like conservative education starts here with like a bunch of like jocks who got like 975 on their SATs, right? And you're just like, what are you doing? Where are you even going with this? Like, is this good for Florida? Is it good for baseball? Is it like, like, my God, are you going to like hire like the best conservative, intellectuals to come in and teach like Straussian political theory to these, bonehead catchers, like what are you even doing? Right? And it's just like, you're just like thrashing around pretending to do something. And like when you thrash with like sufficient energy and get these sort of like little, what look like kind of Winnie wins, you can raise money off of like, we're at a tipping point, the whole thing is about to supersaturate and wokeism is on its way out, and I'm just like, motherfucker, like, I just like, it's embarrassing, and like, I feel like I had to like, pick a fight with Rufo, who like actually likes me. Like, it's really unfortunate. Right. But I don't normally do this, but I'm just like, I have to offer some kind of weak protest to this ridiculous, he's basically saying like, let's do McCarthyism, but like as farce, and like, under the Marxian principle that everything has to repeat as farce. And it's just like, you may score some wins because Claudine Gay is so much lower an intellectual figure than like Alger Hiss. But, prosecuting Alger Hiss didn't even really win anything. And this was the guy who founded the United Nations, right? And like, did you get anything out of that? Did we ever figure out who lost China? Like, no, and it's just like at a certain point when you're just like willfully, what you're doing when you do this stuff is one of two things. Either you're basically disowning, your grandparents who made the attempt to like do McCarthyism and have a John Birch society or whatever. And you're just like, wow, those people, right? I totally disown, like many of them were racists. I don't know how that was allowed, but they were, but we're not like that. We're having, but no wokeism. We're definitely going to beat wokeism and progressivism. And we might even call it communism sometimes, but like, we're not like that, right. And that's why we're going to win, because basically we have good liberal values, right? Because we're wokeism is, we're enlightened. Actually, wokeism is in contradiction with liberal values. It's become quite illiberal. Why not like bring it back to like liberalism? At that point you're really at like real socialism has never been tried or something, and it's just so like, it's just embarrassing, because the thing is that if you don't know this, you're doing something naive. And if you do know this, you're definitely a grifter. And if you're sort of in between those things where you're just like, you're sort of naive, but you're just like, well, like maybe like my wife is fucking around on me, but like I don't really want to know. So like, wow, she left her email open, but I'm not going to look at it, and like the it's embarrassing, and it's kind of doomed, and it's really perpetrating this sort of incredibly fraudulent thing on people. And it's like when you...
Curtis, I unfortunately have to run because I have to go watch my kids. But I think this merits at some point in the future, if you'll come back, a part 2, because I want to talk about the app.
Yeah.
I think your idea for the app. The app is the solution.
The app is the solution. Yeah. No, I mean, in general, what I would say is like, when you're thinking in terms of like, I can't believe in this system, you get to, this system has to be hacked somehow. And when you're hacking a system, you're basically trying to make it operate in a way that it's not supposed to operate. You're trying to, create what security engineers call a weird machine. And like, when you basically open your mind to say, no, this system can't be reformed to be something that actually works. It needs to be hacked out of existence. And at the same time as it's being hacked out of existence, it needs to be replaced with something else. And this process is not going to look anything like any like stupid 20th century LARP. And it's certainly not going to involve like, fighting in the streets, because Americans are such pussies that we can't even fight anymore. And, it has to be pussy friendly, really. And then, once you're sort of thinking in terms of this like pussy friendly coup, essentially, which is like a sort of hack of the system, you're just in such a different context in terms of political techniques and goals and like understanding of how to do things. And yeah, I think that's a good, now that we've sort of talked about the problem, we can come back and be positive and talk about positive solutions. I'm a very positive person.
Awesome. Thanks so much for Curtis. Thanks so much, Curtis, for coming on.
Thank you for coming on, Curtis.
All right. Next time I'll let you talk. Take care.